Chapter 11 of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 11. A Scandal in the Village. In the little hamlet of Harock, in the Isle of St. Loup, there lived a man who, though living under the English flag, was absolutely untypical of the French tradition. He was quite unnoticeable, but that was exactly where he was quite himself. He was not even extraordinarily French, but then it is against the French tradition to be extraordinarily French. Ordinary Frenchmen would only have thought him a little old-fashioned. Imperialistic Englishmen would really have mistaken him for the old John Bull of the caricatures. He was stout, he was quite undistinguished. He had side whiskers, worn just a little longer than John Bull's. He was by name Pierre Durand. He was by trade a wine merchant. He was by politics a conservative Republican. He had been brought up a Catholic, had always thought and acted as an agnostic, and was very mildly returning to the Church in his later years. He had a genius, if one can even use so wild a word in connection with so tame a person, a genius for saying the conventional thing on every conceivable subject, or rather what we in England would call the conventional thing, for it was not convention with him, but solid and manly conviction. Convention implies cant or affection, and he had not the faintest smell of either. He was simply an ordinary citizen with ordinary views, and if you had told him so, he would have taken it as an ordinary compliment. If you had asked him about women, he would have said that one must preserve their domesticity and decorum. He would have used the stalest words, but he would have in reserve the strongest arguments. If you had asked him about government, he would have said that all citizens are free and equal, but he would have meant what he said. If you had asked him about education, he would have said that the young must be trained up in the habits of industry and of respect for their parents. Still he would have set them the example of industry, and he would have been one of the parents whom they could respect. A state of mind so hopelessly central is depressing to the English instinct. But then in England a man announcing these platitudes is generally a fool, and a frightened fool, announcing them out of mere social servility. But Durand was anything but a fool. He had read all the 18th century, and could have defended his platitudes round every angle of 18th century argument. And certainly he was anything but a coward. Swollen and sedentary as he was, he could have hit any man back who touched him with the instant violence of an automatic machine, and dying in a uniform would have seemed to him only the sort of thing that sometimes happens. I am afraid it is impossible to explain this monster amid the exaggerative sects and the eccentric clubs of my country. He was merely a man. He lived in a little villa which was furnished well with comfortable chairs and tables and highly uncomfortable classical pictures and medallions. The yard in his home contained nothing between the two extremes of hard, meager designs of Greek heads and Roman togas, and on the other side a few very vulgar Catholic images in the crudest colors. These were mostly in his daughter's room. He had recently lost his wife, whom he had loved heartily and rather heavily in complete silence, and upon whose grave he was constantly in the habit of placing hideous little wreaths, made out of a sort of black and white beads. To his only daughter he was equally devoted, though he restricted her a good deal under a sort of theoretic alarm about her innocence; an alarm which was peculiarly unnecessary, first, because she was an exceptionally reticent and religious girl, and secondly, because there was hardly anybody else in the place. Madeline Durand was physically a sleepy young woman, and might easily have been supposed to be morally a lazy one. It is, however, certain that the work of her house was done somehow, and it is even more rapidly ascertainable that nobody else did it. The logician is, therefore, driven back upon the assumption that she did it, and that lends a sort of mysterious interest to her personality at the beginning. She had very broad, low, and level brows, which seemed even lower because her warm yellow hair clustered down to her eyebrows, and she had a face just plump enough not to look as powerful as it was. Anything that was heavy in all this was abruptly lightened by two large, light china blue eyes, lightened all of a sudden as if it had been lifted into the air by two big blue butterflies. The rest of her was less than middle sized, and was of a casual and comfortable sort. And she had this difference from such girls as the girl in the motor car, that one did not incline to take in her figure at all, but only her broad and leonine and innocent head. Both the father and the daughter were of the sort that would normally have avoided all observation, that is, all observation in that extraordinary modern world which calls out everything except strength. Both of them had strength below the surface. They were like quiet peasants owning enormous and unquarried mines. The father with his square face and gray side whiskers, the daughter with her square face and golden fringe of hair, were both stronger than they know, stronger than anyone knew. The father believed in civilization, in the storied tower we have erected to affront nature, that is, the father believed in man. The daughter believed in God, and was even stronger. They neither of them believed in themselves, for that is a decadent weakness. The daughter was called a devotee. She left upon ordinary people the impression, the somewhat irritating impression, produced by such a person. It can only be described as the sense of strong water being perpetually poured into some abyss. She did her housework easily. She achieved her social relations sweetly. She was never neglectful and never unkind. This accounted for all that was soft in her, but not for all that was hard. She trod firmly as if going somewhere. She flung her face back as if defying something. She hardly spoke a cross word, yet there was often battle in her eyes. The modern man asked doubtfully where all this silent energy went to. He would have stared still more doubtfully if he had been told that it all went into her prayers. The conventions of the Isle of St. Luke were necessarily a compromise or confusion between those of France and England, and it was vaguely possible for a respectable young lady to have half-attached lovers, in a way that would be impossible to the bourgeoisie of France. One man in particular had made himself an unmistakable figure in the track of this girl as she went to church. He was a short, prosperous-looking man, whose long, bushy black beard and clumsy black umbrella made him seem both shorter and older than he really was, but whose big, bold eyes, and step that spurned the ground, gave him an instant character of youth. His name was Camille Bert, and he was a commercial traveler who had only been in the island an idle week before he began to hover in the tracks of Madeleine Durand. Since everyone knows everyone in so small a place, Madeleine certainly knew him to speak to. But it was not very evident that she ever spoke. He haunted her, however, especially at church, which was, indeed, one of the few certain places for finding her. In her home she had a habit of being invisible, sometimes through insatiable domesticity, sometimes through an equally insatiable solitude. Monsieur Bert did not give the impression of a pious man, though he did give, especially with his eyes, the impression of an honest one. But he went to mass with a simple exactitude that could not be mistaken for a pose, or even for a vulgar fascination. It was perhaps this religious regularity which eventually drew Madeleine into recognition of him. At least it is certain that she spoke twice to him with her square and open smile in the porch of the church, and there was human nature enough in the hamlet to turn even that into gossip. But the real interest arose suddenly as a squall arises with the extraordinary affair that occurred about 5 days after. There was, about a third of a mile beyond the village of Haroc, a large but lonely hotel upon the London or Paris model, but commonly almost entirely empty. Among the accidental group of guests who had come to it at this season was a man whose nationality no one could fix and who bore the non-committal name of Count Gregory. He treated everybody with complete civility and almost in complete silence. On the few occasions when he spoke either French, English, or once, to the priest, Latin, and the general opinion was that he spoke them all wrong. He was a large, lean man, with the stoop of an aged eagle, and even the eagle's nose to complete it. He had old-fashioned military whiskers and mustache dyed with a garish and highly incredible yellow. He had a dress of a showy gentleman, and the manners of a decayed gentleman. He seemed, as with a sort of simplicity, to be trying to be a dandy when he was too old even to know that he was old. Yet he was decidedly a handsome figure with his curled yellow hair and lean fastidious face, and he wore a peculiar frock coat of bright turquoise blue with an unknown order pinned to it, and he carried a large and heavy cane. Despite his silence and his dandified dress and whiskers, the island might never have heard of him but for the extraordinary event of which I have spoken, which fell about in the following way. In such casual atmospheres only the enthusiastic go to benediction; and as the warm blue twilight closed over the little candle-lit church and village, the line of worshippers who went home from the former to the latter thinned out until it broke. On one such evening, at least, no one was in church except the quiet, unconquerable Madeline, 4 old women, 1 fisherman, and, of course, the irrepressible Monsieur Camille Bert. The others seemed to melt away afterwards into the peacock colors of the dim green grass and the dark blue sky. Even Durand was invisible instead of being merely reverentially remote, and Madeline set forth through the patch of black forest alone. She was not in the least afraid of loneliness, because she was not afraid of devils. I think they were afraid of her. In a clearing of the wood, however, which was lit up with the last patch of the perishing sunlight, there advanced upon her suddenly one who was more startling than a devil. The incomprehensible Count Gregory, with his yellow hair like flame, and his face like the white ashes of the flame, was advancing bareheaded towards her, flinging out his arms and his long fingers with a frantic gesture. "We are alone here," he cried, "and you would be at my mercy, only that I am at yours." Then his frantic hands fell by his sides, and he looked up under his brows with an expression that went well with his hard breathing. Madeline Durand had come to a halt at first in childish wonder, and now, with more than masculine self-control, "I fancy I know your face, sir," she said, as if to gain time. "I know I shall not forget yours," said the other, and extended once more his ungainly arms in an unnatural gesture. Then of a sudden there came out of him a spout of wild and yet pompous phrases. "It is as well that you should know the worst and the best. I am a man who knows no limit. I am the most callous of criminals, the most unrepentant of sinners. There is no man in my dominions so vile as I. But my dominions stretch from the olives of Italy to the fir woods of Denmark, and there is no nook of all of them in which I have not done a sin. But when I bear you away I shall be doing my first sacrilege, and also my first act of virtue." He seized her suddenly by the elbow, and she did not scream but only pulled and tugged. Yet though she had not screamed, some one astray in the woods seemed to have heard the struggle. A short but nimble figure came along the woodland path like a humming bullet, and had caught Count Gregory a crack across the face before his own could be recognized. When it was recognized, it was that of Camille, with the black elderly beard and the young ardent eyes. Up to the moment when Camille had hit the Count, Madeline had entertained no doubt that the Count was merely a madman. Now she was startled with a new sanity, for the tall man in the yellow whiskers and yellow mustache first returned the blow of Bert as if it were a sort of duty, and then stepped back with a slight bow and an easy smile. "This need go no further here, Monsieur Bert," he said. "I need not remind you how far it should go elsewhere." "Certainly you need remind me of nothing," answered Camille stolidly. "I am glad you are just not too much of a scoundrel for a gentleman to fight." "We are detaining the lady," said Count Gregory with politeness, and, making a gesture suggesting that he would have taken off his hat if he had had one, he strode away up the avenue of trees and eventually disappeared. He was so complete an aristocrat that he could offer his back to them all the way up that avenue, and his back never once looked uncomfortable. "You must allow me to see you home," said Bert to the girl in a gruff and almost stifled voice. I think we have only a little way to go." "Only a little way," she said, and smiled once more that night, in spite of fatigue and fear, and the world and the flesh and the devil. The glowing and transparent blue of twilight had long been covered by the opaque and slate-like blue of night, when he handed her to the lamp-lit interior of her home. He went out himself into the darkness, walking sturdily, but tearing at his black beard. All the French or semi-French gentry of the district considered this a case in which a duel was natural and inevitable, and neither party had any difficulty in finding seconds, strangers as they were in the place. Two small landowners, who were careful, practicing Catholics, willingly undertook to represent that strict church-goer Camille Bert; while the profligate but apparently powerful Count Gregory found friends in an energetic local doctor who was ready for social promotion, and an accidental Californian tourist who was ready for anything. As no particular purpose could be served by delay, it was arranged that the affair should fall out 3 days afterwards. And when this was settled, the whole community, as it were, turned over again in bed and thought no more about the matter. At least there was only one member of it who seemed to be restless, and that was she who was commonly most restful. On the next night Madeleine Durand went to church as usual, and as usual the stricken Camille was there also. What was not so usual was that when they were a bow shot from the church, Madeleine turned round and walked back to him. "Sir," she began, "it is not wrong of me to speak to you," and the very words gave him a jar of unexpected truth, for in all the novels he had ever read she would have begun, "It is wrong of me to speak to you." She went on with wide and serious eyes like an animal's. "It is not wrong of me to speak to you, because your soul, or anybody's soul, matters so much more than what the world says about anybody. I want to talk to you about what you are going to do." Bert saw in front of him the inevitable heroine of the novels trying to prevent bloodshed, and his pale, firm face became implacable. "I would do anything but that for you," he said, "but no man can be called less than a man." She looked to him for a moment with a face openly puzzled, and then broke into an odd and beautiful half smile. "Oh, I don't mean that," she said. "I don't talk about what I don't understand. No one has ever hit me, and if they had I should not feel as a man may. I am sure it is not the best thing to fight. It would be better to forgive, if one could really forgive. But when people dine with my father and say that fighting a duel is mere murder, of course I can see that is not just. It's all so different, having a reason, and letting the other man know, and using the same guns and things, and doing it in front of your friends. I'm awfully stupid, but I know that men like you aren't murderers. But it wasn't that I meant." "What did you mean?" asked the other, looking broodingly at the earth. "Don't you know," she said, "there is only one more celebration? I thought that as you always go to church, I thought you would communicate this morning." Bert stepped backward with a sort of action she had never seen in him before. It seemed to alter his whole body. "You may be right or wrong to risk dying," said the girl simply. "The poor women in our village risk it whenever they have a baby. You men are the other half of the world. I know nothing about when you ought to die. But surely if you are daring to try and find God beyond the grave and appeal to him, you ought to let him find you when he comes and stands there every morning in our little church." And placid as she was, she made a little gesture of argument, of which the pathos wrung the heart. Monsieur Camille Bert was by no means placid. Before that incomplete gesture and frankly pleading face he retreated as if from the jaws of a dragon. His dark black hair and beard looked utterly unnatural against the startling pallor of his face. When at last he said something, it was, "Oh, God, I can't stand this." He did not say it in French, nor did he, strictly speaking, say it in English. The truth, interesting only to anthropologists, is that he said it in Scotch. "There will be another Mass in a matter of 8 hours," said Madeleine with a sort of business eagerness and energy. And you can do it then, before the fighting. You must forgive me, but I was so frightened that you would not do it at all." Bear seemed to crush his teeth together until they broke, and managed to say between them, "And why should you suppose that I shouldn't do as you say, I mean not to do it at all?" "You always go to Mass," answered the girl, opening her wide blue eyes, "and the Mass is very long and tiresome unless one loves God." Then it was that Bear exploded with a brutality which might have come from Count Gregory, his criminal opponent. He advanced upon Madeline with flaming eyes, and almost took her by the two shoulders. "I do not love God," he cried, speaking French with the broadest Scotch accent. "I do not want to find him. I do not think he is there to be found. I must burst up the show. I must and will say everything. You are the happiest and honestest thing I ever saw in this godless universe, and I am the dirtiest and most dishonest." Madeline looked at him doubtfully for an instant, and then said with a sudden simplicity and cheerfulness, "Oh, but if you are really sorry, it is all right. If you are horribly sorry, it is all the better. You have only to go and tell the priest so, and he will give you God out of his own hands." "I hate your priest and I deny your God," cried the man, "and I tell you God is a lie and a fable and a mask, and for the first time in my life I do not feel superior to God." "What can it all mean?" said Madeline in massive wonder. "Because I am a fable also and a mask," said the man. He had been plucking fiercely at his black beard and hair all the time. Now he suddenly plucked them off and flung them like moulted feathers in the mire. This extraordinary spoliation left in the sunlight the same face, but a much younger head, a head with close chestnut curls and a short chestnut beard. "Now you know the truth," he answered with hard eyes. "I am a cad who has played a crooked trick on a quiet village and a decent woman for a private reason of his own. I might have played it successfully on any other woman. I have hit the one woman on whom it cannot be played. It is just like my damned luck. The plain truth is," and here when he came to the plain truth he boggled and blundered as Evan had done in telling it to the girl in the motor car. "The plain truth is," he said at last, "that I am James Turnbull the atheist. The police are after me, not for atheism, but for being ready to fight for it." "I saw something about you in the newspaper," said the girl, with a simplicity which even surprise could never throw off its balance. "Evan MacIan said there was a God," went on the other, stubbornly, "and I say there isn't. And I have come to fight for the fact that there is no God. It is for that that I have seen this cursed island and your blessed face." "You want me really to believe," said Madeline, with parted lips, "that you think—" "I want you to hate me," cried Turnbull in agony. "I want you to be sick when you think of my name. I am sure there is no God." "But there is," said Madeline, quite quietly, and rather with the air of one telling children about an elephant. "Why, I touched his body only this morning." "You touched a bit of bread," said Turnbull, biting his knuckles. "Oh, I will say anything that can madden you." "You think it is only a bit of bread," said the girl, and her lips tightened ever so little. "I know it is only a bit of bread," said Turnbull with violence. She flung back her open face and smiled. "Then why did you refuse to eat it?" she said. James Turnbull made a little step backward, and for the first time in his life there seemed to break out and blaze in his head thoughts that were not his own. "Why, how silly of them!" cried out Madeline, with quite a schoolgirl gaiety. "Why, how silly of them to call you a blasphemer! Why, you have wrecked your whole little business because you would not commit blasphemy." The man stood, a somewhat comic figure in his tragic bewilderment, with the honest red head of James Turnbull sticking out of the rich and fictitious garments of Camille Bert. But the startled pain of his face was strong enough to obliterate the oddity. "You come down here," continued the lady, with that female emphasis which is so pulverizing in conversation and so feeble at a public meeting, You and your MacIan come down here and put on false beards or noses in order to fight. You pretend to be a Catholic commercial traveller from France. Poor Mr. MacIan has to pretend to be a dissolute nobleman from nowhere. Your scheme succeeds. You pick a quite convincing quarrel. You arrange a quite respectable duel. The duel you have planned so long will come off tomorrow with absolute certainty and safety. And then you throw off your wig and throw up your scheme and throw over your colleague because I ask you to go into a building and eat a bit of bread. And then you dare to tell me that you are sure there is nothing watching us. Then you say you know there is nothing on the very altar you run away from. You know—" "I only know," said Turnbull, "that I must run away from you. This has got beyond any talking." And he plunged along into the village, leaving his black wig and beard lying behind him on the road. As the market-place opened before him he saw Count Gregory, that distinguished foreigner, standing and smoking in elegant meditation at the corner of the local café. He immediately made his way rapidly towards him, considering that a consultation was urgent. But he had hardly crossed half of that stony quadrangle when a window burst open above him, and a head was thrust out, shouting. The man was in his woolen undershirt, but Turnbull knew the energetic, apologetic head of the sergeant of police. He pointed furiously at Turnbull and shouted his name. A policeman ran excitedly from under an archway and tried to collar him. Two men selling vegetables dropped their baskets and joined in the chase. Turnbull dodged the constable, upset one of the men into his own basket, and bounding towards the distinguished foreign count, called to him clamorously, "Come on, MacIan, the hunt is up again." The prompt reply of Count Gregory was to pull off his large yellow whiskers and scatter them on the breeze with an air of considerable relief. Then he joined the flight of Turnbull, and even as he did so, with one wrench of his powerful hands rent and split the strange, thick stick that he carried. Inside it was a naked, old-fashioned rapier. The two got a good start up the road before the whole town was awakened behind them. And halfway up it a similar transformation was seen to take place in Mr. Turnbull's singular umbrella. The two had a long race for the harbour, but the English police were heavy and the French inhabitants were indifferent. In any case, they got used to the notion of the road being clear. And just as they had come to the cliffs, MacIan banged into another gentleman with unmistakable surprise. How he knew he was another gentleman merely by banging into him must remain a mystery. MacIan was a very poor and very sober Scotch gentleman. The other was a very drunk and very wealthy English gentleman. But there was something in the staggered and openly embarrassed apologies that made them understand each other as readily and as quickly and as much as two men talking French in the middle of China. The nearest expression of the type is that it either hits or apologizes, and in this case both apologized. "You seem to be in a hurry," said the unknown Englishman, falling back a step or two in order to laugh with an unnatural heartiness. "What's it all about, eh?" Then before MacIan could get past his sprawling and staggering figure, he ran forward again, and said with a sort of shouting and ear-shattering whisper, "I say, my name is Wilkinson. You know. Wilkinson's entire was my grandfather. Can't drink beer myself. Liver." And he shook his head with extraordinary sagacity. "We really are in a hurry, as you say," said MacIan, summoning a sufficiently pleasant smile, "so if you will let us pass—" "I'll tell you what, you fellows," said the sprawling gentleman, confidentially, while Evan's agonized ears heard behind him the first paces of the pursuit, "if you really are, as you say, in a hurry, I know what it is to be in a hurry. Lord, what a hurry I was in when we all came out of Cartwright's rooms. If you really are in a hurry," and he seemed to steady his voice into a sort of solemnity, "if you are in a hurry, there's nothing like a good yacht for a man in a hurry." "No doubt you're right," said MacIan, and dashed past him in despair. The head of the pursuing host was just showing over the top of the hill behind him. Turnbull had already ducked under the intoxicated gentleman's elbow and fled far in front. "No, but look here," said Mr. Wilkinson, enthusiastically running after MacIan and catching him by the sleeve of his coat. "If you want to hurry you should take a yacht, and if," he said with a burst of rationality, like one leaping to a further point in logic, "if you want a yacht you can have mine." Evan pulled up abruptly and looked back at him. "We are really in the devil of a hurry," he said, "and if you really have a yacht, the truth is that we would give our ears for it." "You'll find it in the harbour," said Wilkinson, struggling with his speech. "Left side of harbour, called Gibson Girl. Can't think why, old fellow, I never lent it to you before." With these words the benevolent Mr. Wilkinson fell flat on his face in the road, but continued to laugh softly, and turned towards his flying companion a face of peculiar peace and benignity. Evan's mind went through a crisis of instantaneous casuistry, in which it may be that he decided wrongly. But about how he decided, his biographer can profess no doubt. 2 minutes afterwards he had overtaken Turnbull and told the tale. 10 minutes afterwards he and Turnbull had somehow tumbled into the yacht called the Gibson Girl, and had somehow pushed off from the island of St. Loup. End of chapter 11. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 12. The Desert Island. Those who happen to hold the view, and Mr. Evan MacIan, now alive and comfortable, is among the number, that something supernatural, some eccentric kindness from God or fairy had guided our adventurers through all their absurd perils, might have found his strongest argument perhaps in their management or mismanagement of Mr. Wilkinson's yacht. Neither of them had the smallest qualification for managing such a vessel. But MacIan had a practical knowledge of the sea in much smaller and quite different boats, while Turnbull had an abstract knowledge of science and some of its applications to navigation, which was worse. The presence of the god or fairy can only be deduced from the fact that they never definitely ran into anything, either a boat, a rock, a quicksand, or a man of war. Apart from this negative description, their voyage would be difficult to describe. It took at least a fortnight, and MacIan, who was certainly the shrewder sailor of the two, realized that they were sailing west into the Atlantic, and were probably by this time past the Scilly Isles. How much farther they stood out into the western sea it was impossible to conjecture. But they felt certain, at least, that they were far enough into that awful gulf between us and America to make it unlikely that they should soon see land again. It was therefore with legitimate excitement that one rainy morning after daybreak they saw that distinct shape of a solitary island standing up against the encircling strip of silver which ran round the skyline and separated the grey and green of the billows from the grey and mauve of the morning clouds. "What can it be?" cried MacIan, in a dry-throated excitement. "I didn't know there were any Atlantic islands so far beyond the Scillies. Good Lord, it can't be Madeira yet." "I thought you were fond of legends and lies and fables," said Turnbull grimly. "Perhaps it's Atlantis." "Of course, it might be," answered the other, quite innocently and gravely, "but I never thought the story about Atlantis was very solidly established." "Whatever it is, we are running on to it," said Turnbull equably, "and we shall be shipwrecked twice at any rate." The naked-looking nose of land projecting from the unknown island was, indeed, growing larger and larger, like the trunk of some terrible and advancing elephant. There seemed to be nothing in particular, at least on this side of the island, except shoals of shellfish lying so thick as almost to make it look like one of those toy grottos that the children make. In one place, however, the coast offered a soft, smooth bay of sand, and even the rudimentary ingenuity of the two amateur mariners managed to run up the little ship with her prow well on shore and her bowsprit pointing upward, as in a sort of idiotic triumph. They tumbled on shore and began to unload the vessel, setting the stores out in rows upon the sand with something of the solemnity of boys playing at pirates. There were Mr. Wilkinson's cigar boxes, and Mr. Wilkinson's dozen of champagne, and Mr. Wilkinson's tinned salmon, and Mr. Wilkinson's tinned tongue, and Mr. Wilkinson's tinned sardines, and every sort of preserved thing that could be seen at the Army and Navy stores. Then MacIan stopped with a jar of pickles in his hand and said abruptly, "I don't know why we're doing all this. I suppose we ought really to fall to and get it over." Then he added more thoughtfully, "Of course, this island seems rather bare, and the survivor—" "The question is," said Turnbull, with cheerful speculation, "whether the survivor will be in a proper frame of mind for potted prawns." MacIan looked down at the rows of tins and bottles, and the cloud of doubt still lowered upon his face. "You will permit me 2 liberties, my dear sir," said Turnbull at last. "The first is to break open this box and light one of Mr. Wilkinson's excellent cigars, which will, I am sure, assist my meditations. The second is to offer a penny for your thoughts, or rather to convulse the already complex finances of this island by betting a penny that I know them." "What on earth are you talking about?" asked MacIan, listlessly, in the manner of an inattentive child. "I know what you are really thinking, MacIan," repeated Turnbull, laughing. "I know what I am thinking, anyhow, and I rather fancy it's the same." "What are you thinking?" asked Evan. "I am thinking, and you are thinking," said Turnbull, "that it is damned silly to waste all that champagne." Something like the spectre of a smile appeared on the unsmiling visage of the Gael, and he made at least no movement of dissent. "We could drink all the wine and smoke all the cigars easily in a week," said Turnbull, "and that would be to die feasting like heroes." "Yes, and there is something else," said MacIan, with slight hesitation. "You see, we are on an almost unknown rock, lost in the Atlantic. The police will never catch us. But then neither may the public ever hear of us, and that was one of the things we wanted." Then after a pause he said, drawing in the sand with his sword point, "She may never hear of it at all." "Well?" inquired the other, puffing at his cigar. "Well," said MacIan, "we might occupy a day or two in drawing up a thorough and complete statement of what we did and why we did it, and all about both our points of view. Then we could leave one copy on the island whatever happens to us, and put another in an empty bottle and send it out to sea, as they do in the books." "A good idea," said Turnbull, "and now let us finish unpacking." As MacIan, a tall, almost ghostly figure, paced along the edge of sand that ran round the islet, the purple but cloudy poetry which was his native element was piled up at its thickest upon his soul. The unique island and the endless sea emphasized the thing solely as an epic. There were no ladies or policemen here to give him a hint either of its farce or its tragedy. "Perhaps when the morning stars were made," he said to himself, "God built this island up from the bottom of the world to be a tower and a theatre for the fight between yea and nay." Then he wandered up to the highest level of the rock, where there was a roof or plateau of level stone. Half an hour afterwards Turnbull found him clearing away the loose sand from this tableland and making it smooth and even. "We will fight up here, Turnbull," said MacIan, "when the time comes. And till the time comes this place shall be sacred." "I thought of having lunch up there," said Turnbull, who had a bottle of champagne in his hand. "No, no, not up here," said MacIan, and came down from the height quite hastily. Before he descended, however, he fixed the 2 swords upright, one at each end of the platform, as if they were human sentinels to guard it under the stars. Then they came down and lunched plentifully in a nest of loose rocks. In the same place that night they supped more plentifully still. The smoke of Mr. Wilkinson's cigars went up ceaseless and strong-smelling, like a pagan sacrifice. The golden glories of Mr. Wilkinson's champagne rose to their heads and poured out of them in fancies and philosophies. And occasionally they would look up at the starlight and the rock and see the space guarded by the 2 cross-hilted swords, which looked like 2 black crosses at either end of a grave. In this primitive and Homeric truce the week passed by. It consisted almost entirely of eating, drinking, smoking, talking, and occasionally singing. They wrote their records and cast loose their bottle. They never ascended to the ominous plateau, they had never stood there save for that single embarrassed minute when they had had no time to take stock of the seascape or the shape of the land. They did not even explore the island, for MacIan was partly concerned in prayer and Turnbull entirely concerned with tobacco. And both these forms of inspiration can be enjoyed by the secluded and even the sedentary. It was on a golden afternoon, the sun sinking over the sea, rayed like the very head of Apollo, when Turnbull tossed off the last half pint from the emptied Wilkinsonian bottle, hurled the bottle into the sea with objectless energy, and went up to where his sword stood waiting for him on the hill. MacIan was already standing heavily by his, with bent head and eyes reading the ground. He had not even troubled to throw a glance round the island or the horizon. But Turnbull, being of a more active and bird-like type of mind, did throw a glance round the scene, the consequence of which was that he nearly fell off the rock. On three sides of this shelly and sandy islet the sea stretched blue and infinite without a speck of land or sail, the same as Turnbull had first seen it, except that the tide being out it showed a few yards more of slanting sand under the roots of the rocks. But on the fourth side the island exhibited a more extraordinary feature. In fact, it exhibited the extraordinary feature of not being an island at all. A long, curving neck of sand, as smooth and wet as the neck of the sea serpent, ran out into the sea and joined their rock to a line of low, billowing, and glistening sand-hills, which the sinking sea had just bared to the sun. Whether they were firm sand or quicksand it was difficult to guess, but there was at least no doubt that they lay on the edge of some larger land, for colorless hills appeared faintly behind them, and no sea could be seen beyond. "Sakes alive!" cried Turnbull, with rolling eyes. "This ain't an island in the Atlantic. We've butted the bally continent of America." MacIan turned his head, and his face, already pale, grew a shade paler. He was by this time walking in a world of omens and hieroglyphics, and he could not read anything but what was baffling or menacing in this brown gigantic arm of the earth stretched out into the sea to seize him. "MacIan," said Turnbull, in his temperate way, "whatever our eternal interrupted tete-a-tetes have taught us or not taught us, at least we need not fear the charge of fear. If it is essential to your emotions, I will cheerfully finish the fight here and now, but I must confess that if you kill me here, I shall die with my curiosity highly excited and unsatisfied upon a minor point of geography." "I do not want to stop now," said the other in his elephantine simplicity, "but we must stop for a moment because it is a sign, perhaps it is a miracle. We must see what is at the end of the road of sand. It may be a bridge built across the gulf by God." "So long as you gratify my query," said Turnbull, laughing and letting back his blade into the sheath, "I do not care for what reason you choose to stop." They clambered down the rocky peninsula and trudged along the sandy isthmus with the plodding resolution of men who seemed almost to have made up their minds to be wanderers on the face of the earth. Despite Turnbull's air of scientific eagerness, he was really the less impatient of the two, and the Highlander went on well ahead of him with passionate strides. By the time they had walked for about a half an hour in the ups and downs of those dreary sands, the distance between the two had lengthened, and MacIan was only a tall figure silhouetted for an instant upon the crest of some sand dune, and then disappearing behind it. This rather increased the Robinson Crusoe feeling in Mr. Turnbull, and he looked about almost disconsolately for some sign of life. What sort of life he expected it to be if it appeared, he did not very clearly know. He has since confessed that he thinks that in his subconsciousness he expected an alligator. The first sign of life that he did see, however, was something more extraordinary than the largest alligator. It was nothing less than the notorious Mr. Evan MacIan coming bounding back across the sand heaps breathless, without his cap and keeping the sword in his hand only by a habit now quite hardened. "Take care, Turnbull!" he cried out from a good distance as he ran. "I've seen a native." "A native?" repeated his companion, whose scenery had of late been chiefly of shellfish. "What the deuce! Do you mean an oyster?" "No," said MacIan, stopping and breathing hard. "I mean a savage. A black man." "Why, where did you see him?" asked the staring editor. "Over there, behind that hill," said the gasping MacIan. "He put up his black head and grinned at me." Turnbull thrust his hands through his red hair like one who gives up the world as a bad riddle. "Lord love a duck," said he, "can it be Jamaica?" Then glancing at his companion with a small frown, as of one slightly suspicious, he said, "I say, don't think me rude, but you're a visionary kind of fellow, and then we drank a great deal. Do you mind waiting here while I go and see for myself?" "Shout if you get into trouble," said the Celt with composure. "You'll find it as I say." Turnbull ran off ahead with a rapidity now far greater than his rival's, and soon vanished over the disputed sandhill. Then 5 minutes passed, and then 7 minutes, and MacIan bit his lip and swung his sword, and the other did not reappear. Finally, with a Gaelic oath, Evan started forward to the rescue, and almost at the same moment the small figure of the missing man appeared on the ridge against the sky. Even at that distance, however, there was something odd about his attitude; so odd that MacIan continued to make his way in that direction. It looked as if he were wounded, or, still more, as if he were ill. He wavered as he came down the slope and seemed flinging himself into peculiar postures. But it was only when he came within 3 feet of MacIan's face that that observer of mankind fully realized that Mr. James Turnbull was roaring with laughter. "You are quite right," sobbed that wholly demoralized journalist. "He's black. Oh, there's no doubt the black's all right, as far as it goes." And then he went off again into convulsions of his humorous ailment. "Whatever is the matter with you?" asked MacIan with stern impatience. "Did you see the nigger—" "I saw the nigger," gasped Turnbull. "I saw the splendid barbarian chief. I saw the Emperor of Ethiopia. Oh, I saw him all right. The nigger's hands and face are a lovely colour, and the nigger—" And he was overtaken once more. "Well, well, well," said MacIan, stamping each monosyllable on the sand. "What about the nigger?" "Well, the truth is," said Turnbull suddenly and startlingly, becoming quite grave and precise, "the truth is, the nigger is a Margate nigger, and we are now on the edge of the Isle of Thanet, a few miles from Margate." Then he had a momentary return of his hysteria, and said, "I say, old boy, I should like to see a chart of our fortnight's cruise in Wilkinson's yacht." MacIan had no smile in answer, but his eager lips opened as if parched for the truth. "You mean to say—" he began. "Yes, I mean to say," said Turnbull, "and I mean to say something funnier still. I have learnt everything I wanted to know from the partially black musician over there, who has taken a run in his war paint to meet a friend in a quiet pub along the coast. The noble savage has told me all about it. The bottle containing our declaration, doctrines, and dying sentiments was washed up on Margate beach yesterday in the presence of 1 alderman, 2 bathing machine men, 3 policemen, 7 doctors, and 113 London clerks on a holiday, to all of whom, whether directly or indirectly, our composition gave enormous literary pleasure. Buck up, old man, this story of ours is a switchback. I have begun to understand the pulse and the time of it. Now we are up in a cathedral, and then we are down in a theatre, where they only play farces. Come, I am quite reconciled. Let us enjoy the farce." But MacIan said nothing, and an instant afterwards Turnbull himself called out in an entirely changed voice, "Oh, this is damnable! This is not to be borne!" MacIan followed his eye along the sandhills. He saw what looked like the momentary and waving figure of the nigger minstrel, and then he saw a heavy running policeman take the turn of the sandhill with the smooth solemnity of a railway train. Chapter 13. Recording by Trisha G. 13 of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 13. The Garden of Peace. Up to this instant Evan MacIan had really understood nothing, but when he saw the policeman he saw everything. He saw his enemies, all the powers and princes of the earth. He suddenly altered from a staring statue to a leaping man of the mountains. "We must break away from him here," he cried briefly, and went like a whirlwind over the sand ridge in a straight line and at a particular angle. When the policeman had finished his admirable railway curve, he found a wall of failing sand between him and the pursued. By the time he had scaled it thrice, slid down twice, and crested it in the third effort, the two flying figures were far in front. They found the sand harder farther on. It began to be crusted with scraps of turf, and in a few moments they were flying easily over an open common of rank sea-grass. They had no easy business, however, for the bottle which they had so innocently sent into the chief gate of Thanet had called to life the police of half a county on their trail. From every side across the grey-green common figures could be seen running and closing in, and it was only when MacIan with his big body broke down the tangled barrier of a little wood, as men break down a door with the shoulder, it was only when they vanished crashing into the underworld of the Black Wood, that their hunters were even instantaneously thrown off the scent. At the risk of struggling a little longer like flies in that black web of twigs and trunks, Evan, who had an instinct of the hunter or the hunted, took an incalculable course through the forest, which let them out at last by a forest opening, quite forgotten by the leaders of the chase. They ran a mile or two farther along the edge of the wood until they reached another and somewhat similar opening. Then MacIan stood utterly still and listened, as animals listen, for every sound in the universe. Then he said, "We are quit of them." And Turnbull said, "Where shall we go now?" MacIan looked at the silver sunset that was closing in, barred by plumy lines of purple cloud. He looked at the high tree-tops that caught the last light, and at the birds going heavily homeward, just as if all these things were bits of written advice that he could read. Then he said, "The best place we can go is to bed. If we can get some sleep in this wood, now everyone has cleared out of it, it will be worth a handicap of 200 yards tomorrow." Turnbull, who was exceptionally lively and laughing in his demeanour, kicked his legs about like a schoolboy, and said he did not want to go to sleep. He walked incessantly and talked very brilliantly, and when at last he lay down on the hard earth, sleep struck him senseless like a hammer. Indeed, he needed the strongest sleep he could get, for the earth was still full of darkness and a kind of morning fog when his fellow fugitive shook him awake. "No more sleep, I'm afraid," said Evan in a heavy, almost submissive voice of apology. "They've gone on past us right enough for a good 30 miles, but now they've found out their mistake and they're coming back." "Are you sure?" said Turnbull, sitting up and rubbing his red eyebrows with his hand. The next moment, however, he had jumped up alive and leaping like a man struck with a shock of cold water, and he was plunging after MacIan along the woodland path. The shape of their old friend the constable had appeared against the pearl and pink of the sunrise. Somehow, it always looked a very funny shape when seen against the sunrise. A wash of weary daylight was breaking over the countryside, and the fields and roads were full of white mist, the kind of white mist that clings in corners like cotton wool. The empty road, along which the chase had taken its turn, was overshadowed on one side by a very high discoloured wall, stained and streaked green, as with seaweed, evidently the high-shouldered sentinel of some great gentleman's estate. A yard or two from the wall ran parallel to it a linked and tangled line of lime trees, forming a kind of cloister along the side of the road. It was under this branching colonnade that the two fugitives fled, almost concealed from their pursuers by the twilight, the mist, and the leaping zoetrope of shadows. Their feet, though beating the ground furiously, made but a faint noise, for they had kicked away their boots in the wood. Their long, antiquated weapons made no jingle or clatter, for they had strapped them across their backs like guitars. They had all the advantages that invisibility and silence can add to speed. 150 yards behind them, down the center of the empty road, the first of their pursuers came pounding and panting, a fat but powerful policeman who had distanced all the rest. He came on at a splendid pace for so portly a figure, but like all heavy bodies in motion, he gave the impression that it would be easier for him to increase his pace than to slacken it suddenly. Nothing short of a brick wall could have abruptly brought him up. Turnbull turned his head slightly and found breath to say something to MacIan. MacIan nodded. Pursuer and pursued were fixed in their distance as they fled, for some quarter of a mile, when they came to a place where 2 or 3 of the trees grew twistedly together, making a special obscurity. Past this place the pursuing policeman went thundering without thought or hesitation. But he was pursuing his shadow or the wind, for Turnbull had put one foot in a crack of the tree and gone up it as quickly and softly as a cat. Somewhat more laboriously, but in equal silence, the long legs of the Highlander had followed, and crouching in crucial silence in the cloud of leaves, they saw the whole posse of their pursuers go by and die into the dust and mists of the distance. The white vapor lay, as it often does, in lean and palpable layers, and even the head of the tree was above it in the half daylight, like a green ship swinging on a sea of foam. But higher yet behind them, and readier to catch the first coming of the sun, ran the rampart of the top of the wall, which in their excitement of escape looked at once indispensable and unattainable, like the wall of heaven. Here, however, it was MacIan's turn to have the advantage, for, though less light-limbed and feline, he was longer and stronger in the arms. In 2 seconds he had tugged up his chin over the wall like a horizontal bar. The next he sat astride of it, like a horse of stone. With his assistance Turnbull vaulted to the same perch, and the two began cautiously to shift along the wall in the direction by which they had come, doubling on their tracks to throw off the last pursuit. MacIan could not rid himself of the fancy of bestriding a steed. The long grey coping of the wall shot out in front of him, like the long grey neck of some nightmare Rosinante. He had the quaint thought that he and Turnbull were 2 knights on one steed on the old shield of the Templars. The nightmare of the stone horse was increased by the white fog, which seemed thicker inside the wall than outside. They could make nothing of the enclosure upon which they were partial trespassers, except that the green and crooked branches of a big apple tree came crawling at them out of the mist, like the tentacles of some green cuttlefish. Anything would serve, however, that was likely to confuse their trail, so they both decided without need of words to use this tree also as a ladder of descent. When they dropped from the lowest branch to the ground, their stockinged feet felt hard gravel beneath them. They had alighted in the middle of a very broad garden path, and the clearing mist permitted them to see the edge of a well-clipped lawn. Though the white vapor was still a veil, it was like the gauzy veil of a transformation scene in a pantomime, for through it there glowed shapeless masses of color, masses which might be clouds of sunrise, or mosaics of gold and crimson, or ladies robed in ruby and emerald draperies. As it thinned yet farther, they saw that it was only flowers, but flowers in such insolent mass and magnificence as can seldom be seen out of the tropics. Purple and crimson rhododendrons rose arrogantly, like rampant heraldic animals against their burning background of laburnum gold. The roses were red hot, the clematis was, so to speak, blue hot, and yet the mere whiteness of the syringa seemed the most violent color of all. As the golden sunlight gradually conquered the mists, it had really something of the sensational sweetness of the slow opening of the gates of Eden. MacIan, whose mind was always haunted with such seraphic or titanic parallels, made some such remark to his companion. But Turnbull only cursed, and said that it was the back garden of some damnable rich man. When the last haze had faded from the ordered paths, the open lawns, and the flaming flower beds, the two realized, not without an abrupt re-examination of their position, that they were not alone in the garden. Down the center of the central garden path, preceded by the blue cloud from a cigarette, was walking a gentleman who evidently understood all the relish of a garden in the very early morning. He was a slim yet satisfied figure, clad in a suit of pale grey tweed, so subdued that the pattern was imperceptible; a costume that was casual, but not by any means careless. His face, which was reflective and somewhat over-refined, was the face of a quite elderly man, though his stringy hair and moustache were still quite yellow. A double eyeglass, with a broad black ribbon, drooped from his aquiline nose, and he smiled, as he communed with himself, with a self-content which was rare and almost irritating. The straw panama on his head was many shades shabbier than his clothes, as if he had caught it up by accident. It needed the full shock of the huge shadow of MacIan, falling across his sunlit path, to rouse him from his smiling reverie. When this had fallen on him, he lifted his head a little and blinked at the intruders with short-sighted benevolence, but with far less surprise than might have been expected. He was a gentleman; that is, he had social presence of mind, whether for kindness or for insolence. "Can I do anything for you?" he said at last. MacIan bowed. "You can extend to us your pardon," he said, for he also came of a whole race of gentlemen without shirts to their backs. "I am afraid we are trespassing. We have just come over the wall." "Over the wall?" repeated the smiling old gentleman, still without letting his surprise come uppermost. "I suppose I am not wrong, sir," continued MacIan, "in supposing that these grounds inside the wall belong to you?" The man in the panama looked at the ground and smoked thoughtfully for a few moments, after which he said, with a sort of matured conviction, "Yes, certainly, the grounds inside the wall really belong to me, and the grounds outside the wall too." "A large proprietor, I imagine," said Turnbull, with a truculent eye. "Yes," answered the old gentleman, looking at him with a steady smile, "a large proprietor." Turnbull's eye grew even more offensive, and he began biting his red beard; but MacIan seemed to recognize a type with which he could deal, and continued quite easily. "I am sure that a man like you will not need to be told that one sees and does a good many things that do not get into the newspapers; things which, on the whole, had better not get into the newspapers." The smile of the large proprietor broadened for a moment under his loose, light moustache, and the other continued with increased confidence. "One sometimes wants to have it out with another man. The police won't allow it in the streets, and then there's the county council, and in the fields even nothing is allowed but posters of pills. But in a gentleman's garden, now—" The strange gentleman smiled again and said, easily enough, "Do you want to fight? What do you want to fight about?" MacIan had understood this man pretty well up to that point. An instinct common to all men with the aristocratic tradition of Europe had guided him. He knew that the kind of man who in his own back garden wears good clothes and spoils them with a bad hat is not the kind of man who has an abstract horror of illegal actions of violence or the evasion of the police. But a man may understand ragging and yet be very far from understanding religious ragging. This seeming host of theirs might comprehend a quarrel of husband and lover, or a difficulty at cards, or even escape from a pursuing tailor; but it still remained doubtful whether he would feel the earth fail under him in that earthquake instant when the Virgin is compared to a goddess of Mesopotamia. Evan MacIan, therefore, whose tact was far from being his strong point, felt the necessity for some compromise in the mode of approach. At last he said, and even then with hesitation, "We are fighting about God. There can be nothing so important as that." The tilted eyeglasses of the old gentleman fell abruptly from his nose, and he thrust his aristocratic chin so far forward that his lean neck seemed to shoot out longer like a telescope. "About God?" he queried, in a key completely new. "Look here," cried Turnbull, taking his turn roughly, "I'll tell you what it's all about. I think that there's no God. I take it that it's nobody's business but mine, or God's if there is one. This young gentleman from the Highlands happens to think that it's his business. In consequence, He first takes a walking stick and smashes my shop, then he takes the same walking stick and tries to smash me. To this I naturally object. I suggest that if it comes to that we should both have sticks. He improves on the suggestion and proposes that we should both have steel-pointed sticks. The police, with characteristic unreasonableness, will not accept either of our proposals. The result is that we run about dodging the police and have jumped over your garden wall into your magnificent garden to throw ourselves on your magnificent hospitality." The face of the old gentleman had grown redder and redder during this address, but it was still smiling, and when he broke out it was with a kind of guffaw. "So you really want to fight with drawn swords in my garden," he asked, "about whether there is really a God?" "Why not?" said MacIan, with his simple monstrosity of speech. "All man's worship began when the Garden of Eden was founded." "Yes, by ," said Turnbull with an oath, "and ended when the Zoological Gardens were founded." "In this garden, in my presence!" cried the stranger, stamping up and down the gravel and choking with laughter. "Whether there is a God!" And he went stamping up and down the garden, making it echo with his unintelligible laughter. Then he came back to them, more composed and wiping his eyes. "Why, how small the world is!" he cried at last. "I can settle the whole matter. Why, I am God!" And he suddenly began to kick and wave his well-clad legs about the lawn. "You are what?" repeated Turnbull, in a tone which is beyond description. "Why, God, of course," answered the other, thoroughly amused. "How funny it is to think that you have tumbled over a garden wall and fallen exactly on the right person. You might have gone floundering about in all sorts of churches and chapels and colleges and schools of philosophy looking for some evidence of the existence of God. Why, there is no evidence except seeing him. And now you've seen him. You've seen him dance." And the obliging old gentleman instantly stood on one leg without relaxing at all the grave and cultured benignity of his expression. "I understood that this garden," began the bewildered MacIan. "Quite so, said the man on one leg, nodding gravely. "I said this garden belonged to me and the land outside it. So they do. So does the country beyond that, and the sea beyond that, and all the rest of the earth. So does the moon. So do the sun and stars." And he added, with a smile of apology, "You see, I am God." Turnbull and MacIan looked at him for one moment with a sort of notion that perhaps he was not too old to be merely playing the fool. But after staring steadily for an instant, Turnbull saw the hard and horrible earnestness in the man's eyes behind all his empty animation. Then Turnbull looked very gravely at the strict gravel walls and the gay flower beds, and the long rectangular red brick building which the mist had left evident beyond them. Then he looked at MacIan. Almost at the same moment another man came walking quickly round the regal clump of rhododendrons. He had the look of a prosperous banker, wore a good tall silk hat, was almost stout enough to burst the buttons of a fine frock coat. But he was talking to himself, and one of his elbows had a singular outward jerk as he went by. End of chapter 13. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 14. A Museum of Souls. The man with the good hat and the jumping elbow went by very quickly, but the man with the bad hat, who thought he was God, overtook him. He ran after him and jumped over a bed of geraniums to catch him. "I beg your Majesty's pardon," he said with mock humility, "but here is a quarrel which you ought really to judge." Then as he led the heavy, silk-hatted man back towards the group, he caught MacIan's ear in order to whisper, "This poor gentleman is mad. He thinks he is Edward VII." At this the self-appointed creator slightly winked. "Of course you won't trust him much. Come to me for everything. But in my position one has to meet so many people. One has to be broad-minded." The big banker in the black frock coat and hat was standing quite grave and dignified on the lawn, save for his slight twitch of one limb, and he did not seem by any means unworthy of the part which the other promptly forced upon him. "My dear fellow," said the man in the straw hat, "these two gentlemen are going to fight a duel of the utmost importance. Your own royal position and my much humbler one surely indicate us as the proper seconds. Seconds. Yes, seconds." And here the speaker was once more shaken with his old malady of laughter. "Yes, you and I are both seconds, and these two gentlemen can obviously fight in front of us. You, he, are the king. I am God. Really, they could hardly have better supporters. They have come to the right place." Then Turnbull, who had been staring with a frown at the fresh turf, burst out with a rather bitter laugh, and cried, throwing his red head in the air, "Yes, by God, MacIan, I think we have come to the right place." And MacIan answered, with an adamantine stupidity, "Any place is the right place where they will let us do it." There was a long stillness, and their eyes involuntarily took in the landscape, as they had taken in all the landscapes of their everlasting combat: the bright, square garden behind the shop, the whole lift and leaning of the side of Hampstead Heath, the little garden of the decadent choked with flowers, the square of sand beside the sea at sunrise. They both felt at the same moment all the breadth and blossoming beauty of that paradise, the colored trees, the natural and restful nooks, and also the great wall of stone, more awful than the wall of China, from which no flesh could flee. Turnbull was moodily balancing his sword in his hand as the other spoke. Then he started, for a mouth whispered quite close to his ear. With a softness incredible in any cat, the huge, heavy man in the black hat and frock coat had crept across the lawn from his own side and was saying in his ear, "Don't trust that second of yours. He's mad, and not so mad either, for he's frightfully cunning and sharp. Don't believe the story he tells you about why I hate him. I know the story he'll tell. I overheard it when the housekeeper was talking to the postman. It's too long to talk about now, and I expect we're watched, but—" Something in Turnbull made him want suddenly to be sick on the grass. The mere healthy and heathen horror of the unclean. The mere inhumane hatred of the inhuman state of madness. He seemed to hear all round him the hateful whispers of that place, innumerable as leaves whispering in the wind, and each of them telling eagerly some evil that had not happened, or some terrific secret which was not true. All the rationalist and plain man revolted within him against bowing down for a moment in that forest of deception and egotistical darkness. He wanted to blow up that palace of delusions with dynamite, and in some wild way, which I will not defend, he tried to do it. He looked across at MacIan and said, "Oh, I can't stand this." "Can't stand what?" asked his opponent, eyeing him doubtfully. "Shall we say the atmosphere?" replied Turnbull. "One can't use uncivil expressions even to a deity. The fact is, I don't like having God for my second." "Sir," said that being in a state of great offense, "in my position I am not used to having my favors refused. Do you know who I am?" The editor of the Atheist turned upon him like one who has lost all patience, and exploded. "Yes, you are God, aren't you?" he said abruptly. "Why do we have two sets of teeth?" "Teeth?" spluttered the genteel lunatic. "Teeth?" "Yes," cried Turnbull, advancing on him swiftly and with animated gestures. "Why does teething hurt? Why do growing pains hurt? Why are measles catching? Why does a rose have thorns? Why do rhinoceroses have horns? Why is the horn on the top of the nose? Why haven't I a horn on the top of my nose, eh?" And he struck the bridge of his nose smartly with his forefinger to indicate the place of the omission, and then wagged the finger menacingly at the Creator. "I've often wanted to meet you," he resumed sternly after a pause, "to hold you accountable for all the idiocy and cruelty of this muddled and meaningless world of yours. You make 100 seeds, and only one bears fruit. You make a million worlds, and only one seems inhabited. What do you mean by it, eh? What do you mean by it?" The unhappy lunatic had fallen back before this quite novel form of attack, and lifted his burnt-out cigarette almost like one warding off a blow. Turnbull went on like a torrent. "A man died yesterday in Ealing. You murdered him. A girl had the toothache in Croydon. You gave it to her. 50 sailors were drowned off Selsey Bill. You scuttled their ship. What have you got to say for yourself, eh?" The representative of omnipotence looked as if he had left most of these things to his subordinates. He passed a hand over his wrinkling brow, and said in a voice much saner than any he had yet used, "Well, if you dislike my assistance, of course, perhaps the other gentleman—" "The other gentleman," cried Turnbull scornfully, "is a submissive and loyal and obedient gentleman. He likes the people who wear crowns, whether of diamonds or of stars. He believes in the divine right of kings, and it is appropriate enough that he should have the king for his second. But it is not appropriate to me that I should have God for my second. God is not good enough. I dislike and deny the divine right of kings. But I dislike more and I deny more the divine right of divinity." Then after a pause in which he swallowed his passion, he said to MacIan, "You have got the right second anyhow." The Highlander did not answer, but stood as if thunderstruck with one long and heavy thought. Then at last he turned abruptly to his second in the silk hat, and said, "Who are you?" The man in the silk hat blinked and bridled in affected surprise, like one who was in truth accustomed to be doubted. "I am King Edward VII," he said with shaky arrogance. "Do you doubt my word?" "I do not doubt it in the least," answered MacIan. "Then why," said the large man in the silk hat, trembling from head to foot, "why do you wear your hat before the king?" "Why should I take it off," retorted MacIan with equal heat, "before a usurper?" Turnbull swung round on his heel. "Well, really," he said, "I thought at least you were a loyal subject." "I am the only loyal subject," answered the Gael. "For nearly 30 years I have walked these islands, and have not found another." "You are always hard to follow," remarked Turnbull genially, "and sometimes so much so as to be hardly worth following." "I alone am loyal," insisted MacIan, "for I alone am in rebellion. I am ready at any instant to restore the Stuarts. I am ready at any instant to defy the Hanoverian brood. And I defy it now, even when face to face with the actual ruler of the enormous British Empire." And folding his arms and throwing back his lean, hawk-like face, he haughtily confronted the man with the formal frock-coat and the eccentric elbow. "What right had you stunted German squires," he cried, "to interfere in a quarrel between Scotch and English and Irish gentlemen? Who made you, whose fathers could not splutter English while they walked in Whitehall, who made you the judge between the Republic of Sydney and the monarchy of Montrose? What had your sires to do with England that they should have the foul offering of the blood of Derwentwater and the heart of Jimmy Dawson? Where are the corpses of Culloden? Where is the blood of Lochiel?" MacIan advanced upon his opponent with a bony and pointed finger, as if indicating the exact pocket in which the blood of that Cameron was probably kept; and Edward VII fell back a few paces in considerable confusion. "What good have you ever done to us?" he continued in harsher and harsher accents, forcing the other back towards the flower beds. "What good have you ever done, you race of German sausages? Yards of barbarian etiquette to throttle the freedom of aristocracy. Gas of northern metaphysics to blow up Broadchurch bishops like balloons. Bad pictures and bad manners, and pantheism, and the Albert Memorial. Go back to Hanover, you humbug! Go to—" Before the end of this tirade the arrogance of the monarch had entirely given way. He had fairly turned tail, and was trundling away down the path. MacIan strode after him, still preaching and flourishing his large lean hands. The other two remained in the center of the lawn, Turnbull in convulsions of laughter, the lunatic in convulsions of disgust. Almost at the same moment a third figure came stepping swiftly across the lawn. The advancing figure walked with a stoop, and yet somehow flung his forked and narrow beard forward. That carefully cut and pointed yellow beard was, indeed, the most emphatic thing about him. When he clasped his hands behind him, under the tails of his coat, he would wag his beard at a man like a big forefinger. It performed almost all his gestures. It was more important than the glittering eyeglasses through which he looked or the beautiful bleating voice in which he spoke. His face and neck were of a lusty red, but lean and stringy. He always wore his expensive gold-rimmed eyeglasses slightly askew upon his aquiline nose, and he always showed two gleaming foreteeth under his mustache, in a smile so perpetual as to earn the reputation of a sneer. But for the crooked glasses, his dress was always exquisite, and but for the smile he was perfectly and perennially depressed. "Don't you think," said the newcomer, with a sort of supercilious entreaty, "that we had all better come in to breakfast? It is such a mistake to wait for breakfast. It spoils one's temper so much." "Quite so," replied Turnbull, seriously. "There seems almost to have been a little quarrelling here," said the man with the goatish beard. "It is a rather long story," said Turnbull, smiling. "Originally, it might be called a phase in the quarrel between science and religion." The newcomer started slightly, and Turnbull replied to the question on his face. "Oh, yes," he said, "I am science." "I congratulate you heartily," answered the other. "I am Dr. Quayle." Turnbull's eyes did not move, but he realized that the man in the Panama hat had lost all his ease of a landed proprietor and had withdrawn to a distance of 30 yards, where he stood glaring with all the contraction of fear and hatred that can stiffen a cat. MacIan was sitting somewhat disconsolately on a stump of tree, his large black head half buried in his large brown hands, when Turnbull strode up to him chewing a cigarette. He did not look up, but his comrade and enemy addressed him like one who must free himself of his feelings. "Well, I hope at any rate," he said, "that you like your precious religion now. I hope you like the society of this poor devil whom your damned tracts and hymns and priests have driven out of his wits. 5 men in this place, they tell me, 5 men in this place who might have been fathers of families, and every one of them thinks he is God the Father. Oh, you may talk about the ugliness of science, but there is no one here who thinks he is protoplasm." "They naturally prefer a bright part," said MacIan wearily. "Protoplasm is not worth going mad about." "At least," said Turnbull savagely, "it was your Jesus Christ who started all this bosh about being God." For one moment MacIan opened the eyes of battle. Then his tightened lips took a crooked smile, and he said quite calmly, "No, the idea is older. It was Satan who first said that he was God." "Then what," asked Turnbull very slowly, as he softly picked a flower, "what is the difference between Christ and Satan?" "It is quite simple," replied the Highlander. "Christ descended into hell. Satan fell into it." "Does it make much odds?" asked the freethinker. "It makes all the odds," said the other. "One of them wanted to go up and went down. The other wanted to go down and went up. A God can be humble, a devil can only be humbled." "Why are you always wanting to humble a man?" asked Turnbull, knitting his brows. "It affects me as ungenerous." "Why were you wanting to humble a God when you found him in this garden?" asked MacIan. "That was an extreme case of impudence," said Turnbull. "Granting the man has almighty pretensions, I think he was very modest," said MacIan. "It is we who are arrogant, who know we are only men. The ordinary man in the street is more of a monster than that poor fellow, for the man in the street treats himself as God Almighty when he knows he isn't. He expects the universe to turn round him, though he knows he isn't the center." "Well," said Turnbull, sitting down on the grass, "this is a digression, anyhow. What I want to point out is, that your faith does end in asylums and my science doesn't." "Doesn't it, by George!" cried MacIan scornfully. "There are a few men here who are mad on God, and a few who are mad on the Bible. But I bet there are many more who are simply mad on madness." "Do you really believe it?" asked the other. "Scores of them, I should say," answered MacIan. "Fellows who have read medical books or fellows whose fathers and uncles had something hereditary in their heads. The whole air they breathe is mad." "All the same," said Turnbull shrewdly, "I bet you haven't found a madman of that sort." "I bet I have," cried Evan with unusual animation. "I've been walking about the garden talking to a poor chap all the morning. He's simply been broken down and driven raving by your damned science. Talk about believing one is God, why, it's quite an old, comfortable fireside fancy compared with the sort of things this fellow believes. He believes that there is a God, but that he is better than God. He says God will be afraid to face him. He says one is always progressing beyond the best. He put his arm in mine and whispered in my ear, as if it were the apocalypse, 'Never trust a God that you can't improve on.'" "What can he have meant?" said the atheist, with all his logic awake. "Obviously one should not trust any God that one can improve on." "It is the way he talks," said MacIan almost indifferently. "But he says rummier things than that. He says that a man's doctor ought to decide what woman he marries, and he says that children ought not to be brought up by their parents, because a physical partiality will then distort the judgment of the educator." "Oh, dear!" said Turnbull, laughing. "You have certainly come across a pretty hard case, and incidentally proved your own. I suppose some men do lose their wits through science, as through love and other good things." "And he says," went on MacIan monotonously, "that he cannot see why anyone should suppose that a triangle is a three-sided figure. He says that on some higher plane—" Turnbull leapt to his feet as if by an electric shock. "I never could have believed," he cried, "that you had humour enough to tell a lie. You've gone a bit too far, old man, with your little joke. Even in a lunatic asylum there can't be anybody who, having thought out the matter, thinks that a triangle has not got three sides. If he exists he must be a new era in human psychology. But he doesn't exist." "I will go and fetch him," said MacIan calmly. "I left the poor fellow wandering about by the nasturtium bed." MacIan vanished, and in a few moments returned, trailing with him his own discovery among lunatics, who was a slender man with a fixed smile and an unfixed and rolling head. He had a goat-like beard just long enough to be shaken in a strong wind. Turnbull sprang to his feet and was like one who is speechless through choking a sudden shout of laughter. "Why, you great donkey!" he shouted in an ear-shattering whisper. "That's not one of the patients at all. That's one of the doctors." Evan looked back at the leering head with the long pointed beard and repeated the word inquiringly. "One of the doctors?" "Oh, you know what I mean," said Turnbull impatiently. "The medical authorities of the place." Evan was still staring back curiously at the beaming and bearded creature behind him. "The mad doctors," said Turnbull shortly. "Quite so," said MacIan. After a rather restless silence Turnbull plucked MacIan by the elbow and pulled him aside. "For goodness' sake," he said, "don't offend this fellow. He may be as mad as 10 hatters if you like, but he has us between his finger and thumb. This is the very time he appointed to talk with us about our exeat." "But what can it matter?" asked the wondering MacIan. "He can't keep us in the asylum. We're not mad." "Jackass," said Turnbull heartily, "of course we're not mad. Of course if we are medically examined and the thing is thrashed out, they will find we are not mad. But don't you see that if the thing is thrashed out, it will mean letters to this reference and telegrams to that, and that at the first word of who we are, we shall be taken out of a madhouse where we may smoke to a jail where we mayn't. No, if we manage this very quietly, he may merely let us out at the front door as stray revelers. If there's half an hour of inquiry, we are cooked." MacIan looked at the grass frowningly for a few seconds, and then said in a new, small and childish voice, "I am awfully stupid, Mr. Turnbull. You must be patient with me." Turnbull caught Evan's elbow again with quite another gesture. "Come," he cried, with the harsh voice of one who hides emotion. "Come, and let us be tactful in chorus." The doctor with the pointed beard was already slanting it forward at a more than usually acute angle, with the smile that expressed expectancy. "I hope I do not hurry you, gentlemen," he said, with the faintest suggestion of a sneer at their hurried consultation, "but I believe you wanted to see me at 11:30. "I am most awfully sorry, doctor," said Turnbull with ready amiability. "I never meant to keep you waiting, but the silly accident that has landed us in your garden may have some rather serious consequences to our friends elsewhere, and my friend here was just drawing my attention to some of them." Quite so," said the doctor hurriedly. "If you really want to put anything before me, I can give you a few moments in my consulting room." He led them rapidly into a small but imposing apartment, which seemed to be built and furnished entirely in red varnished wood. There was one desk occupied with carefully docketed papers, and there were several chairs of the red varnished wood, though of different shape. All along the wall ran something that might have been a bookcase, only that it was not filled with books, but with flat, oblong slabs or cases of the same polished dark red consistency. What those flat wooden cases were they could form no conception. The doctor sat down with a polite impatience on his professional perch. MacIan remained standing, but Turnbull threw himself almost with luxury into a hard wooden armchair. "This is a most absurd business, doctor," he said, "and I am ashamed to take up the time of busy professional men with such pranks from outside. The plain fact is, that he and I and a pack of silly men and girls have organized a game across this part of the country, a sort of combination of hare and hounds, and hide and seek. I dare say you've heard of it. We are the hares, and, seeing your high wall look so inviting, we tumbled over it, and naturally were a little startled with what we found on the other side." "Quite so," said the doctor mildly. "I can understand that you were startled." Turnbull had expected him to ask what place was the headquarters of the new exhilarating game, and who were the male and female enthusiasts who had brought it to such perfection. In fact, Turnbull was busy making up these personal and topographical particulars. As the doctor did not ask the question, he grew slightly uneasy, and risked the question. "I hope you will accept my assurance that the thing was an accident, and that no intrusion was meant." "Oh, yes, sir," replied the doctor, smiling. "I accept everything that you say." "In that case," said Turnbull, rising genially, "we must not further interrupt your important duties. I suppose there will be someone to let us out?" "No," said the doctor, still smiling steadily and pleasantly. "There will be no one to let you out." "Can we let ourselves out, then?" asked Turnbull in some surprise. "Why, of course not," said the beaming scientist. "Think how dangerous that would be in a place like this." "Then how the devil are we to get out?" cried Turnbull, losing his manners for the first time. "It is a question of time, of receptivity, and treatment," said the doctor, arching his eyebrows indifferently. "I do not regard either of your cases as incurable." And with that the man of the world was struck dumb, and, as in all intolerable moments, the word was with the unworldly. MacIan took one stride to the table, leant across it, and said, "We can't stop here. We are not mad people." "We don't use the crude phrase," said the doctor, smiling at his patent leather boots. "But you can't think us mad," thundered MacIan. You never saw us before. You know nothing about us. You haven't even examined us." The doctor threw back his head and beard. "Oh, yes," he said, "very thoroughly." "But you can't shut a man up on your mere impressions without documents or certificates or anything." The doctor got languidly to his feet. "Quite so," he said. "You certainly ought to see the documents." He went across to the curious mock bookshelves and took down one of the flat mahogany cases. This he opened with a curious key at his watch chain, and laying back a flap, revealed a squire of foolscap covered with close but quite clear writing. The first 3 words were in such large copybook hand that they caught the eye even at a distance. They were, "MacIan, Evan Stuart." Evan bent his angry eagle face over it, yet something blurred it, and he could never swear he saw it distinctly. He saw something that began, "Prenatal influences predisposing to mania. Grandfather believed in return of the Stuarts. Mother carried bone of St. Eulalia, with which she touched children in sickness. Marked religious mania at early age." Evan fell back and fought for his speech. "Oh," he burst out at last, "oh, if all this world I have walked in had been as sane as my mother was!" Then he compressed his temples with his hands, as if to crush them, and then lifted suddenly a face that looked fresh and young, as if he had dipped and washed it in some holy well. "Very well," he cried. "I will take the sour with the sweet. I will pay the penalty of having enjoyed God in this monstrous modern earth that cannot enjoy man or beast. I will die happy in your madhouse, only because I know what I know. Let it be granted, then, MacIan is a mystic, MacIan is a maniac. But this honest shopkeeper and editor whom I have dragged on my inhuman escapades, you cannot keep him. He will go free, thank God. He is not down in any damned document. His ancestor, I am certain, did not die at Culloden. His mother, I swear, had no relics. Let my friend out of your front door, and as for me—" The doctor had already gone across to the laden shelves, and after a few minutes' short-sighted peering, had pulled down another parallelogram of dark red wood. This also he unlocked on the table, and with the same unerring egotistic eye one of the company saw the words, written in large letters, "Turnbull, James." Hitherto Turnbull himself had somewhat scornfully surrendered his part in the whole business, but he was too honest and unaffected not to start at his own name. After the name, the inscription appeared to run, "Unique case of eleutheromania. Parentage, as so often in such cases, prosaic and healthy. Eleutheromaniac signs occurred early, however, leading him to attach himself to the individualist Bradlaugh. Recent outbreak of pure anarchy—" Turnbull slammed the case to, almost smashing it, and said with a burst of savage laughter, "Oh, come along, MacIan. I don't care so much, even about getting out of the madhouse, if only we get out of this room. You were right enough, MacIan, when you spoke about mad doctors." Somehow they found themselves out in the cool, green garden, and then, after a stunned silence, Turnbull said, "There is one thing that was puzzling me all the time, and I understand it now." "What do you mean?" asked Evan. "No man by will or wit," answered Turnbull, "can get out of this garden, and yet we got into it merely by jumping over a garden wall. The whole thing explains itself easily enough. That undefended wall was an open trap. It was a trap laid for 2 celebrated lunatics. They saw us get in right enough, and they will see that we do not get out." Evan gazed at the garden wall gravely for more than a minute, and then he nodded without a word. Chapter 15.